Hello again. Welcome to the 5th video in this Twitter integration video series. In this video we're going to cover how to create a data handler in order to assist with populating controls as well as persistent information to the database. What we want to happen is when I click on the Twitter button in the navigator bar, the first time I'm going to be presented with a login dialog. I'm going to type in some credentials, and then when I click on the login button, I want my credentials to be stored in the SuperOffice database. That way, the second time I come to this Twitter page, the dialog login button will no longer appear, and my credentials will be discoverable by the archive provider that will populate an archive control that we have yet to define. Let's switch over to Visual Studio now, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, the data handler is going to serve two purposes for our application. The first is in the Twitter page, the main page, we have this script control that will actually invoke or open the login dialog. We've set a dependency here, we've kind of hardwired it in this switch statement to say when value 1 equals 1, then go ahead and execute this JavaScript. What we really want to happen is to have a value here that's defined in the data handler, and then dependent on that value we'll go ahead and open the dialog. The value that we want to depend on is whether or not the currently logged on user has valid Twitter credentials stored in the SuperOffice database. If he does, then there's no need to present this login dialog. We should just go ahead and show the Twitter page and populate the archive control. The second purpose of a data handler is, if we go back to the login dialog, is to actually populate the text box for both the username as well as the password down here. We're going to essentially set the data source values equal to a data carrier that is stored in the data handler data carrier collection. What will happen essentially is when a user types in his credentials and then clicks on the login button, the values that are stored in these fields will be persisted to their data source, which will be defined here, which will be the data carriers. Now the data handlers method, then the save method, will be invoked, and then it is in the save method we'll have the opportunity to persist those credentials. Now the way that a data handler's save method is invoked is not just automatic. It's not done for you in any way, shape, or form. The way that data handler save operations work, as well as delete operations, are controlled at the card level. So every card can have a designated data handler. Well, actually, can they have more? In order to define a data handler for a specific card element, we have to come underneath the views element and specify a config section for the card. So I just had some on the clipboard here, so I defined a config section for the card, and I have this data handlers to save method defined. Within that, I'll specify a single data handler reference element, which will contain the name or the ID value of the data handler I want to assign to this save operation for this card. That means that when I click on the login button, the save method that is invoked is the save method defined in this handler. Now I don't have this one defined in my project yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out, and then let's go ahead and take a look at what these data handlers and data carriers are. Then we'll come back and set up all of the controls correctly. In order to take a look at data handlers and data carriers, I've created a project before, so I'm going to open up an existing application, And this one's called devnet.twitter, so it's an existing project. I'll just open that right up. And here we have defined a Twitter data handler, and I have two carriers, a Twitter carrier as well as a credentials carrier. A data handler is very similar to that of a view model in a model view model. So let's go ahead and take a look at this class a little bit and see how it's being defined, and then we'll talk about how it's being used. Defined is, we're going to create a class called Twitter Data Handler. We're going to inherit from the superoffice.crm.web.data datahandler base class. And this contains a lot of nice functionality that we get to leverage for free. I'm going to, at the very top here, define two string constants that are going to represent keys inside a string object dictionary that will contain the data sources for our controls on our pages and dialogues. So the first thing we want to look at is an initialize method inside this data handler. The initialize method is going to be called anytime one of our dialogues or page resources are requested from the page framework. There's a load method that is going to be called for every data carrier that does not already exist in a data carrier collection when it's being accessed as a data source on a control defined on a page. We'll come down to a save method, and the save method is invoked whenever the mode equals save is issued from the page update JavaScript method, or for example when we click on the OK button or the login button on our login dialog. If you remember back in the login page all the way down to bottom before I switched over to code, we had added that one new config section to the card element, and we specified a data handler to save. It will then be invoked. Okay, so the actual data sources for our controls are these two things that we had talked about earlier. I call them Twitter entities here, Twitter entity and credential entity. The data types though are called Twitter carrier and credentials carrier. So let's not get those confused. Let's go ahead and take a look at the credentials carrier class first, because this class is going to be responsible for collecting the credentials if a currently logged on user has not already saved his credentials. And then we're going to go ahead and leverage this data source to persist those credentials to the database. This class contains an application name, device name, and device ID property, and these correspond to the foreign key tables and how we're going to store the actual credentials. If we take a look at how the foreign key system works, we'll explain this a little bit better and make more sense. Okay, so in the foreign key system we have three tables that are affected. We have the foreign app table, which contains all of the application definitions. We have the foreign device table, which has essentially two keys inside of it that allow us to define many different subsections for applications that we define. For example, we can define DevNet as an application, and within the foreign device I can define Twitter as a device name. Credentials here is defined, and I can define many different device IDs. Credentials is a device ID, Twitter is the device name, credentials is a device ID. I can have Twitter dot search, for example, as I defined here. And then for each one of these device combinations, I can have one or many foreign keys associated with each one of those. So you can think of this in a way of a multi-dimensional property bag, if you will. If we take a look down here below, we'll see we have in the application in the foreign app table, we'll define a single application, DevNet. And then within the foreign device table, we'll define a device name and we'll define a device ID. Of course, we can have many different device IDs that would give us a two-dimensional property bag for an app, a device, and a device ID. Next, we have obviously the key value pairs that are stored inside the foreign key table. And this essentially allows us this third, even fourth dimension of a property bag. So we can index into any one of these and get a great deal of combinations to store a great deal of information. Now we're going to keep it simple, and we're only going to have one app. We're going to have the same device and device ID, and then we're going to have two different keys. We're going to use a username as a key and then the password as a key, and then the actual values are going to correspond to the users that these credentials belong to. The way that these key value pairs become unique is that within the foreign key table you have record IDs associated with each one of these that are going to be different for each user. And we're also going to play with the key a little bit so that those are also unique for each user. And coming back to the credentials carrier, we'll also see a username and password property that are going to be used to actually data bind the values we store in the user and password fields in the login dialog. When we click on the login button, those values are going to be updated into its data source, which is actually in the data handler. So if we go back to the data handler, when we click on save, before the save method actually gets invoked, those values are going to be data bound to its data source. And now in the credentials carrier, when we get that out of the data carrier collection, is now going to contain the username and password that were typed into the dialog. And that allows us to drop down into this method, which allows us to see, okay, does the credentials already exist in the database? No, that's great. We'll check, and then we're going to go ahead and call against Twitter and say, are these valid credentials? As long as they're valid credentials, then we can go even further and say, great, we'll use our credentials helper class to create those credentials, which will persist them into the SuperOffice database. Now, we no longer want anything else to happen down here. We're going to talk about this routine a little bit later, but this is essentially just to actually persist a tweet or to write a tweet to Twitter in order to post it. But at this point, we're just concerned with the login dialog. We just need to get some credentials in the database and see how that works. Okay, so the first thing we want to do now is make sure that our DLL that contains our data handler and the types that we're concerned with actually get copied into the website's bin directory. So I went ahead, and if I look in the properties and the build events in the post build, I'm copying in the DLL itself, which is the target path, into the website's bin directory. I'm also going to copy in the PDB file to make sure I can debug into it. Down below, we're also going to copy in two dependencies that I'm using. I'm using actually the Tweet Sharp library, the open source library, downloaded it off Google Code, and they have a dependency on for JSON operations. So we're going to copy those 4 DLLs into the website's bin directory, and then we're going to be able to use them. Okay, so I'll just hit F5, build F6 in order to build those, and I'm going to go throughout our application and define where the data handler definitions need to be. The first place we need to go is into SO object mapping and make sure that it's defined there. Now we have this one default in the website's app data web client and web folder, right? But if you remember, I said that we were going to make changes to this, and so we copied it and put it to where we defined our external application or our custom path if we come down and we find towards the end the client configuration provider, we have a custom path defined for our C6web3385 directory. So if I go ahead and look at the object mapping that we had copied into there, let's see, C63385, here it is, SO object mapping. And we'll make sure that this is actually defined here, so I'll have to add that in. And I did take the liberty to add that in just before. So I've created a new data handler line. I've given it a mapping name called Twitter Datahandler, and this is going to be referenced in our pages and dialogues. This is the name that you use. We've defined the assembly that this data handler resides in, devnet.twitter, and we specified the object, which is essentially the full path to that class. If we go back and we look at that one more time, at the very top, we'll see it's in namespace devnet.twitter, and the class name for the data handler is Twitter Data Handler. So that matches. Now we want to go into our dialogues and page that depend on this data handler. We'll start off at the login page, and we'll scroll to the top, and here in the data section we want to define our data handler. So I'm going to go ahead and take a second to do that. Okay. In the login page, we do not have all of the dependencies on, let's say, the navigator data handler, or the button bar data handler, or the mini panel data handler, anything like that. We only have this single dependency on our data handler that's going to actually going to create credentials, as well as other things that we'll get to in subsequent videos. But we just want to worry about persistent credentials. So coming back to the foreign key system, we're going to, in the config section of the data handler, define 3 elements which are user definable. I could have called these things anything, and they will be passed into the data handler's initialize method. If you remember, we'll come back to the data handler. In the initialize method, it takes in 2 arguments. The first one is an XML node, which corresponds to the elements in this config section. So it's up to me to know what these are called in my data handler, so that I can use this XML utility class that SuperOffice has provided, or you could write your own, to get the node text. So I'm going to go ahead and say config select single node, and I have to know what these names were. So it's going to go ahead and grab these text values out of here, and I'm going to store them inside my credentials carrier. Great. If it's not found, it will provide some defaults. That's the behavior on the getNode text method of the SuperOffice util.xmlutil class. Then I'll go ahead and add in this credentials carrier into my data carriers collection by calling the add method. Great. Now that that's defined, we can imagine when the login dialog appears, it's going to invoke the initialize method. These values are going to get passed in, and it's going to populate the credentials carrier object inside the data carriers collection. Then any one of these objects can be referenced in the data handler when required. So now I'm going to go ahead, and we want to go down to the bottom and re-enable this save data handler to save type. So I'll go ahead and just uncomment that, and now the Twitter data handler will be invoked whenever a save operation is invoked or required. Great. The username and password here are going to be data bound to the properties of our credentials carrier. So the username text box here will just begin to type, it's in the Twitter data handler. Whoops. And then it's inside the credential carrier, or actually credential entity, is the string value. Let's just go ahead and verify that. We'll scroll up to the top, credential entity. That's in fact the name. Come down just to make absolutely sure. And for this, it's the username. So we'll say user name. Great. And I'll come down and I'll set the data source for the password as well. Okay. Save that. And what that means is, just one final time, I'll cover this, and that is when the save operation occurs on this dialog, what will happen is these controls will call the update data source method in this control, which essentially takes the values that are stored inside this control in the text box, and it will assign those values to the username property of the credential carrier type held inside the Twitter Datahandler data carriers collection. Okay, same thing for password. Now the whole thing that's going to set this dialog off is the script control that we have in the Twitter page. So I'm going to copy this data handler from here because it's also going to be used inside the Twitter page. So if we come back down to the Twitter page, right, we'll come up to the data handlers section. I'm going to go ahead and append this data handler here because we're going to leverage the same data handler from two different dialogues. That's totally possible. We could have, of course, used two different data handlers for the Twitter page and a different one for the Twitter login dialog, but I decided to go ahead and isolate all of that and maintain it in a single data handler. That's completely doable. Now we want to come down and we want to change the SO script control and how that works. If you remember, we kind of hard-coded this before, and we said, okay, when the value 1 equals 1, then go ahead and show the dialog.open method. As you can see, I've changed that now, and I've switched the values, and I said, okay, now when the Twitter data handler Twitter entity dot isValidUser data property is equal to false, then show the login dialog. Otherwise, ignore it. So what that means is, as long as the current valid or the current user has credentials that are stored in the database, he will be a valid user, and this JavaScript code will be ignored. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Twitter entity class, or it's the Twitter carrier class, and see what that looks like. We looked at the credentials carrier, and now we'll look at the Twitter carrier. The Twitter carrier is, well, like it sounds, it's going to actually contain that property that we just looked at, isValidUser, which is going to get set via the credentials helper. We'll get to that in a bit. But it also contains this Twitter status, which is a type defined in the tweetsharp.model namespace. This contains properties that you would expect of any Twitter post. So it's going to contain the screen name of the user who submitted the post, the time it was created, the actual text of the post, and various other things. We're going to go ahead and use this so that we can use those values to populate our controls, specifically when it comes to retweeting existing tweets in our archive control. But that's in a much later video. Okay, so let's kind of bring all of this together. If we come back to the Twitter page, we're going to see when we click on the Twitter button in the navigator bar, it's going to call a page update in order to show us this Twitter page. Okay, so there seems to be been a problem. If I switch over to the login dialog, it gives me a little bit more descriptive method. So it says element data has invalid child element data handler. Aha! So I'm missing the data handlers element that encapsulates that. Great. That's good. So at least now I know what the problem is. So I'll come back here to the login dialog, scroll up to the top, and I'll make sure to wrap that around a data handlers element. Great. I'll just put that down here. Good. We'll save that. We'll come back and log back in with TJ3, who should not have stored credentials in the database. We'll make sure that our breakpoint is still set up, so we're still attached. Click on Twitter. Great, now we're in the initialize method for the login page. I'll go past that. Now we're going to attempt to load the Twitter entity. We'll expect that that equals its valid user property is set to false again. Now we can see the initialize method being called once again. Now for the login dialog, I'll go ahead and go past that, and the website is loading, and now the login dialog appears just as we would expect. So now I'm going to go ahead and specify some credentials. Let's say SODevNet again, and some password. I'll click login. Initialize method is going to be called first. Let's see, we'll make sure we have a breakpoint set on save. We do. So we'll keep going past that. And now the save method is called, and we'll see. Let's see, we'll step in over this. We'll populate the credentials carrier, which we'll drill down into it. And remember, this sets the username and password that was in the login dialog. Now, fair to say that this is not my password, so this should fail. Shouldn't throw an exception, but it should at least not step into here, because we don't want to create these credentials. It's not a valid Twitter user, so it's not going to drop into here. So we'll go ahead, we'll go past that. And data carriers does not contain a Twitter entity, so it's not going to try and submit a tweet to the Twitter web service. So we can just go ahead and blow past that. Now the web page just appears blank, so nothing's happened. But you can imagine that when the I'll go back to the company. When I do submit good credentials, then it would drop in there and it would work as expected. So let's go ahead and do that. I can do that now. I'll go ahead and use another account, my personal one, and I'll say my password. Let's say I'll click on login. The initialize method is called. I'll go past that, and now save is going to be called, and I'll step over that, and I'll see if the credentials already exist. They don't. Then we'll check to see if it's a valid Twitter user, which it is, and then I will go ahead and create those credentials in the database, and then it will return and close the login dialog and then just show the Twitter page as we would expect. So now when I come back to company and I go to Twitter, it's going to be able to find those credentials, so it's not going to have to actually save them again, right? So there's no login dialog anymore. Those credentials are stored and persisted to the database. I can go ahead and execute this query, which will go ahead and discover my username and password for my personal Twitter account. You can see that it's stored under a different associate ID, and my associate ID has a different person ID as well. This query, if you're wondering, is just searching into the foreign app table, the foreign device, and the foreign key, and my encrypted credentials. So that is how you work with a data handler in order to take data from a dialog, invoke the data handler, and persist those data fields values to a database. We're going to get a lot more practice in working with data handlers in subsequent videos. We still have yet to build the archive control on the Twitter page, and behind that build the archive provider to actually populate it with data. Now all of those operations also require a little bit of assistance by the data handler. More importantly, the final steps in this video series will create the log or the Twitter entry dialog, which then you'll be able to actually submit tweets via 6Web to the Twitter website and persist those tweets there. So we're going to leverage the data handler in that dialog quite a bit in order to populate it before we open the dialog, populate its data sources, and then display that information, especially when we're going to do a retweet. And then we'll take that information, update the data sources in the carrier collection, and then submit those changes to the Twitter web service. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you got something out of this video. Focusing heavily on data handlers. There's a lot more to discover, so hopefully you're stuck with me so far, and hopefully you'll stick with me for the rest of the series. Happy coding!